We have talked about Pascal's wager, and today I have a new wager to offer you. I am calling it the Pansexual Wager. It does sound very deranged, which is probably why you are watching this, but trust me, it is a good idea. When we consider identities of sexuality, we are considering a collection of social constructs that are surrounded by an entourage of powerful social forces. We are considering highly complex identities that arise from incredibly complex human societies and incredibly complex human minds. Heterosexuality is absolutely surrounded by incredibly pervasive and coercive social forces. It is an identity founded on rigorous indoctrination. It is an identity that all too often falsely proclaims itself to be absolute and all-encompassing. It is an identity that claims to be an absolute and set-in-stone feature of one's sexuality. Homosexuality emerges in response to this. It establishes itself as an alternative, although it maintains the set-in-stone absolutism of the heterosexual identity. It frees itself from the social coercion associated with heterosexuality, but maintains the declaration of one absolute knowable sexuality that acts as a guide to all of one's life. Many stumble towards it as they become aware of their own impulses and an overwhelming desire to reject heterosexuality. It is after all the main alternative presented in the dichotomy, in spite of heterosexuality's regular attempts to dominate and subdue it. In the background, further sexualities emerge. Bisexuality, asexuality, and pansexuality all present alternative approaches that break with systems of gender, absolutism, and inherent sexual interest entirely. These identities act as further rejections of the dominant heterosexual norm and further expansions of human liberty. The question that I wish to consider today is whether or not any approach to sexuality is superior and more rational than its opponents. This is most certainly a very controversial question to even consider, and there is no doubt that my conclusions are highly controversial. They are guaranteed to piss off a very large number of people. I present them anyway, because I don't care. First, let us consider heterosexuality. I cannot for the life of me understand why anybody would identify as heterosexual. I say this not from an emotional viewpoint, but from the most purely rational one that my mind is capable of arriving at. Heterosexuality is an identity that is absolutely surrounded by downright coercive social forces. It is enforced through indoctrination and lies. It is promoted by social tyranny of the purest form. It exists in incredibly complex societies. Identification with it is reached through the activities of incredibly complex brains. To declare oneself heterosexual seems most foolish. How can one possibly make such an absolute claim about one's preferences when those preferences are vigorously promoted by coercion and indoctrination? How can one possibly make such an absolute claim about one's preferences when those preferences are absolutely surrounded by powerful social influences? How can one possibly make such an absolute claim about one's preferences when said preferences exist in such an incredibly complex and misunderstanding-prone state of affairs? I think that we have no hope of understanding ourselves. I accept the fact that I cannot and will not ever understand myself. Sometimes embracing that fact is the closest that we can get to understanding ourselves. I do not understand heterosexuality. Even if I felt completely straight, why would I identify as straight? I haven't met every man out there. I would never dare to risk restricting and controlling myself by willingly embracing a potentially inaccurate label for no gain. When people embrace labels, they all too often live to describe the label. They live to conform to it. The label does not describe them, they describe it. In attempting to understand ourselves, we inadvertently prevent ourselves from being ourselves. This is particularly true of heterosexuality, given the absolutely momentous amount of social coercion, influence, and indoctrination that surrounds it. To some extent, however, this is also true of homosexuality. It is easy for one to run to homosexuality as soon as they feel the urge to reject heterosexuality. This is the main alternative in what is often presented as a dichotomy. Homosexual identities have done a great deal to undermine the dominance of heterosexuality and increase human liberty. This is a good thing, but at the same time, there are shortcomings to be seen here. These shortcomings are largely a product of the fact that homosexuality is a rejection of heterosexuality that is in many regards based on heterosexuality. Homosexuality does not reject the conventional idea of heterosexuality outright. It rejects a very important part of it, but it doesn't reject it entirely. It maintains the declaration of set-in-stone, unchanging, and knowable gender preferences. I take issue with this because even though homosexuality is free of the coercive forces and indoctrination that surround heterosexuality, it still exists surrounded by highly complex factors. I take issue with this because I think that absolute unchanging gender preferences are unknowable. I think any attempt to know them will lead to people restricting and controlling themselves in failed attempts to understand themselves. I think any attempt to know these preferences will necessarily lead to people enslaving themselves to labels. People becoming social actors that act out labels, rather than finding labels to describe them, because the former is an all too common consequence of the latter. Any attempt to know absolute preferences will lead to a great number of people restricting and controlling themselves for virtually no gain. The only gain is a perceived sense of identity and knowing, when said sense of identity and knowing is very often simply an act of conformity to a label. One is not finding words that describe them, one is finding words to describe. One is imposing standards upon themselves in a search for answers to questions which cannot be answered. Labels should work as our slaves, sometimes however they become our masters. Let us return to heterosexuality. Heterosexuality is ultimately responsible for this because the embrace of homosexual identity is ultimately an attempt by people to reaffirm and establish their identity in a world which brutally oppresses it. It is an attempt to stand strong and find oneself in a world dominated by an absolute heterosexual force that wants to prevent that happening. Whatever its flaws, homosexual identity is only the way it is because being that way was a necessary consequence of responding to heterosexual oppression. In order to face said oppression, people had little choice but to congregate around a strong opposing identity with a very similar structure founded upon knowable absolute preferences. Homosexuality was a product of people casting off the chains of heterosexuality. Chains tend to come off one at a time. Now we can move beyond that and cast off the lighter, yet still existent chains of homosexuality. Ultimately, any identity that claims absolute gender preferences are knowable is a form of enslavement. It is an attempt to know that which cannot be known. It is a claim to know something about oneself that cannot be known. It is therefore an attempt to impose a set of potentially inaccurate, restricting, controlling, and deeply unnecessary standards of behavior upon oneself, and therefore an act of enslavement to a label. To claim to know something about oneself that cannot be known in such a way is to impose a standard of behavior onto oneself. It is to enslave oneself to a label. When we claim to know that which cannot be known about ourselves, we are enslaving ourselves to unnecessary and potentially inaccurate, restrictive, and controlling labels for the sake of feeling that we know ourselves a little better. The only thing that we really know is the identity of the actor that we intend on playing, the social mold that we intend on filling. We did not discover who we are. We imposed standards upon ourselves out of a desperate and irrational desire to know the unknowable. We would be happier if we embraced the reality of unknowability and in doing so freed ourselves of the chains of the label. But what then is the answer? If heterosexuality is greatly flawed as an oppressive identity, and homosexuality somewhat flawed, then what identity can we rationally embrace? The answer is of course pansexuality. Pansexuality is typically defined as attraction to people regardless of their gender. I view sexuality not as a matter of viewing oneself as what one is or what one is attracted to. I view sexuality as a matter of strategically selecting an understanding of oneself. This is an infinitely more rational way of approaching sexuality. When we try to know ourselves in such ways, we enslave ourselves to labels. We must be rational and strategic in our understandings of our identity if we are to be free. We must base labels not on what we feel, but instead on what we think. Some of you will likely be wondering where exactly bisexuality fits into my analysis. Bisexuality is in many ways a more rational sexuality than homosexuality, and most certainly heterosexuality. I prefer to use pansexuality, however, as pansexuality moves discussions of sexuality beyond stupid and pointless gender divides. The asexual spectrum is also worth mentioning here, to shrug off the mistaken idea that sexual attraction is absolute. But there is no need to get too far into discussing that today. Now let us consider the wager. What sexuality is it the most rational for one to embrace? Let us view this question as a wager. We have three main options: heterosexuality, homosexuality, and pansexuality. Is identification with one label more rational than identification with the others? Heterosexuality has a substantial chance of being applied inaccurately, given the coercive social forces and indoctrination that surround it, and the very complex nature of the human mind and human society. Homosexuality has a smaller, but still present chance of being applied inaccurately, given the very complex nature of the human mind and human society. If either of these labels are applied inaccurately, they will restrict and control the individual. They will deprive them of their liberty and capacity to be their truest, freest, and happiest self. In applying these labels, we are taking a risk. No matter how certain we may feel, people misapply labels with great certainty and regularity. There are many people who are completely convinced they are straight, who are anything but. There are many people who are completely convinced they are gay, who are anything but. People are often convinced of the accuracy of inaccurate labels. It is very hard for one to understand their own mind. Then we have pansexuality. Given the complex nature of the human society and human mind, pansexuality is perfectly likely to be applied inaccurately. Although it is easier to apply exclusionary preferences inaccurately than inclusionary ones, it is easier to make absolute claims about what one does like than what one doesn't. But what happens if pansexuality is applied inaccurately? No restriction, no control, no loss of liberty. It won't matter. If you are only attracted to one kind of person, you will only be in relationships with that kind of person. If you are truly straight, you will only be in relationships with people of the opposite gender. If you are truly gay, you will only be in relationships with people of the same gender. Unless you have enslaved yourself to the label, the you know it when you see it pansexual approach will lead to the same places as your previous label, but it has no chance of restricting or controlling you as that label did. Pansexuality, because it isn't exclusionary, lacks any capacity to restrict or control the individual. It is as simple as being in relationships with people you are attracted to, taking things on a case-by-case basis, knowing it when you see it. Other than the following of basic moral ideas, there isn't really anything more that is needed than that. There is no need to risk restricting and controlling oneself with unnecessary labels. I think we should intentionally choose an inaccurate label, Inaccurate it may be, but at least it isn't restrictive and controlling. I think in this wager, pansexuality is the rational choice. It is certainly my choice. I would rather intentionally choose an inaccurate label that will not restrict me than choose a more accurate label that has a chance of restricting me. I care far more for my liberty than the accuracy of a label. We should choose labels in accordance with rationality, not emotion. This is the best way of interacting with potentially restricting and controlling labels. We need to be strategic. We must not feel, we must think. Out of two labels with a chance of restricting me and one with no such chance, I will always choose the latter, regardless of accuracy. Risking my own enslavement to a stupid label is not worth it just for the sake of accuracy. Rational actors place existence as their freest, truest, and happiest selves above the accuracy of labels. Such rational selection ensures that I will never live as a slave to an inaccurate label. I will never try to perfectly embody my label because I have embraced the fact that it isn't necessarily accurate, and that doesn't bother me. I selected it not because it was accurate, but because it was most amicable to the preservation of my liberty. A rational actor forced to choose between two potentially restricting and controlling labels that claim to know the unknowable, and one entirely unrestricting, non-controlling label that embraces the limits of its knowledge, will always be inclined to choose the latter. This is only rational. Based on the wager, we can conclude that the strategic selection of some sexuality identities is more rational than the selection of others. Out of two identities with a chance of restricting and controlling the individual, and one without any such chance, the rational actor will always choose the latter. The rational actor chooses pansexuality. Sexuality is not about what you are actually attracted to. It is about the strategic choice of labels. Labels of such weight must be chosen based upon rationality, not emotion. Emotion is irrational, and irrationality poses too much of a risk when choosing labels that have a great capacity to restrict, control, and enslave. We must select labels not based on what we feel we are, but instead based on what we think has the slimmest chance of restricting, controlling, and enslaving us. This is the burden of the rational actor when considering their identity. Consider your identity not simply as a means of understanding yourself. Consider it as what it is. A potential threat to your liberty. A threat to your capacity to be your freest, truest, and happiest self. A potential force of enslavement, restriction, and control. Selecting labels is not something to be taken lightly. It demands seriousness, and it demands cold rationality. Thinking will come before feeling to anyone who wishes to avoid their enslavement. Some will think this does not apply to them. Some will be enslaved to the label. Some will, in an attempt to know themselves, force themselves into a social mold. They will spend their life playing a social character, conforming to a mold. This is not a fate that the rational actor will risk. Why risk becoming a slave to the label? Why risk restricting and controlling yourself for no gain? Why not just take sexuality on a case-by-case basis? Why not just have a you know it when you see it approach? Why not just be in relationships with people that you're attracted to? Why not be guided solely by morality and enjoyment with no unnecessary labels and restrictions? Nobody is attracted to men or women. People are attracted to individuals. We will all be happier and freer. We will all be our truest selves when we embrace that fact.